History as it happens, April 26, 2022. Nuclear terror, Redux.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
Now, we must be ready for a new danger, the atomic bomb.
Unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
Communist infiltration, communist indoctrination, communist subversion, and the international communist conspiracy to sap and impurify all of our precious bodily fluids.
Russia's war in Ukraine has raised the possibility, however remote, of nuclear conflict, reviving a faint cultural memory from the Cold War days, the sense that human civilization can be destroyed in a matter of minutes. There are still thousands of warheads in the world, and a new arms race is underway, as once landmark agreements fade away. Calling Dr. Strangelove. That's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
This treaty protects the interests of America's friends and allies. It also embodies another important principle, the need for glasnost.
We have agreed to eliminate the world's most dangerous weapons, heavy ICBMs, and all other multiple warhead
that the United States of America is withdrawing from this almost 30-year-old treaty.
You'd be foolish not to be concerned about a nuclear war here. Although the chances of nuclear use are low, they are not zero, and that should terrify us. And I would say that we're closer to nuclear use now than at any time since the early 1980s.
But I do say no more than 10 to 20 million killed, tops, depending on the break.
School kids in the 1950s were introduced to Bert the Turtle, a cartoon character who starred in civil defense films.
There was a turtle by the name of Bert, and Bert the Turtle was very alert. When danger threatened him, he never got hurt.
Bert made sure kids remembered two words, just in case nuclear war at the Soviet Union broke out in the middle of math class.
Duck and cover.
That's right, hide under your desk and everything will be okay.
We all know the atomic bomb is very dangerous. Since it may be used against us, we must get ready for it, just as we are ready for many other dangers that are...
The idea behind these films was to educate more than frighten grade schoolers. They were part of a cultural milieu that has long since faded into history. Fear of communism, fear of nuclear war, the opening acts of the Cold War. The U.S. had 300 atomic bombs in 1950. That number climbed to 27,000 nuclear weapons by the early 1960s. And it was then, October 1962, arguably the closest the world has ever come to deliberate nuclear war.
The characteristic of these new missile sites indicate two distinct types of installations. Several of them include medium-range ballistic missiles capable of carrying a nuclear warhead for a distance of more than 1,000 nautical miles. Each of these missiles, in short, is capable of striking Washington, D.C., the Panama Canal, Cape Canaveral, Mexico City, or any other city in the southeastern part of the United States.
The Cuban Missile Crisis ended after 13 days. Khrushchev agreed to remove the Cuban missiles in exchange for the U.S. promising not to invade Cuba, and President Kennedy secretly agreed to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey. That was 60 years ago, and since then there have been a few more close calls when nuclear war almost started by accident. The possibility that nuclear Armageddon could be triggered deliberately or accidentally spurred a global movement to ban those weapons. In 1982, the largest demonstration on record took place in Central Park, the Nuclear Freeze Rally.
I've got a question for 1 million people. Do you want to freeze the arms race? Do you think that Ronald Reagan is going to freeze the arms race?
That was a young congressman from Massachusetts, Ed Markey. And as for Ronald Reagan, he would become the anti-nuclear movement's most important ally. The following year, the president watched the made-for-TV film The Day After, with its horrifying images of Americans being instantaneously vaporized in a Soviet first strike.
Danny!
Reagan confided to his diary that the movie left him depressed, but all the more convinced of the need for a strong deterrent to prevent nuclear war. Eventually, though, Reagan sought détente with the new Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, and in 1987 they signed the INF Treaty, the first time the superpowers agreed to reduce their nuclear arsenals and eliminate an entire category of weapons.
On the Soviet side, over 1,500 deployed warheads will be removed, and all ground-launched intermediate-range missiles, including the SS-20s, will be destroyed. On our side, our entire complement of Pershing II and ground-launched cruise missiles, with some 400 deployed warheads, will all be destroyed.
The day after was just one example of the way nuclear war suffused the culture in campus debates, presidential politics, in hundreds of books and movies. And the best movie ever made about nuclear combat came in 1964.
But it is necessary now to make a choice, to choose between two admittedly regrettable, but nevertheless distinguishable post-war environments. One where you got 20 million people killed, and the other where you got 150 million people killed.
You're talking about mass murder, General, not war.
Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove was inspired by a popular book from 1960, On Thermonuclear War, in which author Herman Kahn argues, in a kind of nutty way, that nuclear war wasn't only possible but also winnable, and that the after effects could be survivable, even tolerable, for the winning side. Ideas that made their way into Dr. Strangelove's screenplay.
When they go down into the mine, everyone will still be alive. There will be no shocking memories, and the prevailing motion will be one of nostalgia for those left behind, combined with a spirit of bold curiosity for the adventure ahead.
So in pop culture, protest movements, international politics, what to do about nuclear weapons was an inescapable issue during the Cold War. You know, the other day I was in a store in my neighborhood. I'm very friendly with the workers there. We joke around a lot, and we talk about my podcast sometimes. I told them I was preparing an episode about nuclear war, and I asked, when was the last time they thought about it? Never was their answer. The USSR? What was that? Well, I suppose I could not blame them. It's simply not front of mind the way it used to be, even for me, a child of the 1980s. Until now, that is, as the war in Ukraine grinds on, as the U.S. continues to pour weapons into the country, provoking warnings from Moscow, as the threat of escalation intensifies. Joseph Cirincione is a distinguished non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, and he's been working on proliferation issues for 40 years. He is the former president of Plowshares and served on the International Security Advisory Board for Secretaries of State Hillary Clinton and John Kerry. He has also advised the presidential campaign of Barack Obama, among others. Joe Cirincione, welcome.
Thank you very much, Martin. Pleasure to be with you.
So I'm going to ask you about what's going on in Ukraine and a little bit about the history as well. Probably a lot about the history of nuclear war or the potential for nuclear war. But off the bat here, right off the bat, I just want to ask you, are you concerned about a potential nuclear exchange right now? Because when I start to think about this and talk about it out loud, I tend to sound crazy, right? Because who could be so crazy as to actually start a nuclear war?
You'd be foolish not to be concerned about a nuclear war here. Although the chances of nuclear use are low, they are not zero, and that should terrify us. And I would say that we're closer to nuclear use now than at any time since the early 1980s, when millions of people around the world were worried that the United States and then Soviet Union would get into a nuclear exchange, or the 1960s, the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the reason you're worried about this is that you are very close to having U.S. and Russian forces come into direct combat. And that is a scenario we have avoided for the 77 years of the nuclear age. There's never been sustained combat between U.S. and Russian forces, and we're close to that. And there are people calling for that. And once that starts, it is a slippery and pretty quick slope to escalate to major combat, and with that, the risk of nuclear use. So that's the worry.
You mentioned the early 1980s. That was one of the coldest periods of the Cold War before Reagan changed his approach to the Soviet Union. But at that time, there was a lack of trust, a lack of real communication. We're seeing that same kind of situation today where there's no real relationship. That's a problem, isn't it?
It is. I started my career in national security when I moved to Washington in 1981 to go to Georgetown. I got a graduate degree, and I never left. I started working for the House Armed Services Committee staff, and that was a very frightening period. And it's hard for people to remember just how concerned it was until you remember the demonstrations against nuclear war. 1982, 1 million people in Central Park in New York City protesting against the war, all in Europe. Millions of people afraid that Europe was going to be turned into a nuclear battleground. And it is, as you say, both sides were engaged in nuclear buildups. Ronald Reagan's first term was marked by a massive nuclear buildup. This is what he had campaigned on, to close the window of vulnerability, as his advisors saw it. And that meant new land-based missiles, new submarines, new bombers, and the Russians, the Soviets, were doing the same. And in fact, that scared both sides. When Ronald Reagan realized how close we had come to nuclear war after a 1983 NATO exercise, where he found out that the Russians had thought that exercise was a pretense for a first strike, that the U.S. was actually preparing to strike first, Reagan was stunned. He didn't believe that the Soviets would think that we would start a nuclear war, but they did. And it was that revelation, plus Reagan's longtime concern about nuclear weapons, that led to a change in his second term, where he became the greatest arms control president in history and started negotiating not with Brezhnev, he had died, but Mikhail Gorbachev. And they achieved breakthroughs that not only limited the nuclear arms race, but then reversed it. And for the first time, negotiated treaties that eliminated thousands and thousands of nuclear weapons.
The importance of this treaty transcends numbers. We have listened to the wisdom in an old Russian maxim, and I'm sure you're familiar with it. Mr. General Secretary, though my pronunciation may give you difficulty, the maxim is dovyai no provyai, trust but verify.
And got us on the course that then prevailed for 30, 40 years until the present moment, when the reductions have stopped and the nuclear arms race is ticking back up again, with both the United States and Russia fielding new and even different types of nuclear weapons. So in some ways, we've come full circle.
I feel like there's a loss of control on the world stage when it comes to this issue. Do you agree?
I agree. And part of that is because what we have done during this period, we have actually taken down many of the nuclear guardrails that Ronald Reagan and George Bush and other presidents put in place. Treaties restricting arms in certain areas, certain types of weapons. Just in the last decade or 2 decades, we've seen U.S. presidents pull out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty.
President Putin and I have also agreed that my decision to withdraw from the treaty will not in any way undermine our new relationship or Russian security. As President Putin said in Crawford, we are on the path to a fundamentally different relationship.
Then U.S. and Russia pulling out of the Reagan's Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, the Open Skies Treaty. Those are all gone. As you know, the only treaty we have left is the New START Treaty, and that expires in 4 years. So yeah, the guardrails are off, and you have the rise of a new nuclear power, China. Even though China's had nuclear weapons since 1964, they're currently engaged in expanding their relatively modest arsenal. And that has led some people to conclude there will soon be this three-way conflict. The United States, Russia, and China contending. And that is a very complicated sort of game theory problem. It's much more difficult to predict the outcomes when you have what they call the three-body problem. It increases the uncertainty, increases the risk. So you're right, Martin, to be concerned about the new nuclear era.
And those Cold War era agreements still, of course, left plenty of nuclear missiles around. But what they did was de-escalate, right? They built up trust. When two sides are friendlier, there's less of a chance that they're going to go to war. I want to talk a little bit about cultural awareness. Mary Elise Cerati, the historian, at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies brought this up with me recently, and I've been thinking about it. I'm 46 years old. You don't have to tell anyone how old you are, Joe. But I do remember as a teenager the late Cold War. And even though I wasn't paying attention to politics at all, everyone knew. You knew that there was the potential for nuclear war. It was kind of built in, right? It was in the air, even if the chances were remote. That cultural awareness is gone, even though there are still plenty of nuclear missiles around. Why do you think that is?
I think the cultural aspect of this is just fascinating, and we'll talk about it. But let me just set the stage as why that is different now than it was even 20 years ago, 30 years ago. I think most people thought with the end of the Cold War that the nuclear threat was over. The Reagan-Gorbachev treaties began while the Cold War was still on. We slashed the arsenals by 50%. Then George H.W. Bush slashed them by another 50%. And we were in a steady decline. I mean, it's really remarkable to think about how crazily large the U.S. and Russian arsenals were. We each had about 30,000 nuclear weapons. We're down to somewhere around 5,000 or 6,000 nuclear weapons each. Still an enormous destructive force, enough to destroy the world several times over, but an 85% decline. And everybody thought, okay, there we go. We're on the road to eliminating these weapons step by step, very carefully. But we stopped. The reductions are over. The treaties are over, and people haven't caught up with this new reality, and they don't see nuclear weapons. I mean, it's not like the other great threats that the planet faces. You know, of all the challenges we face, there are only 3 that threaten destruction on a planetary scale. We have to add pandemics now, which can kill people in great numbers over years, climate change, which can end human civilization over decades, and nuclear weapons, which can end human civilization in an afternoon. These 3 crises are similar in the scale of their destructive consequences, but very different in how you see them. You feel the pandemic, obviously. You can't go through a day without discussing it. You can see the effect of climate change. It's all around us. You don't see nuclear weapons. They are hidden under the Great Plains of ICBM silos and under the Great Plains of America, or in submarines that patrol deep under the world's oceans, or bombers in remote bases. You don't see them. And so it's an idea rather than a physical reality. And our popular media no longer reflects the threat the way the media did in the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
Well, in the 50s, I remember my parents telling me about the drills they had to do, like hiding under a desk in your classroom.
Right, those are gone.
Duck and cover.
Be sure and remember what Bert the Turtle just did, friends, because every one of us must remember to do the same thing. That's what this film is all about. Duck and cover.
The anti-communist hysteria of that era, too, probably contributed to it, wouldn't you say?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But, the movies were something that let you safely explore the topic. So you'd go into a darkened theater and you would watch on the beach where a U.S. submarine crew is awaiting the wave of radioactivity caused by a global war as they seek shelter in Australia. You never see an explosion, but you feel the dread, and you experience that for 90 minutes, and you get to sit and process what this is, or fail-safe, for example. Or in the early 1960s, probably the greatest anti-nuclear movie of all, Dr. Strangelove, in a comic way.
My favorite.
You saw these adult films that could help you think through it in a quiet, in a meditative way. Or you saw science fiction movies, which was the other way this was expressed.
Through allegory, yeah.
For example, Them, a great movie in the 1950s about giant ants coming out of the nuclear test sites in Nevada, or The Day the Earth Stood Still, where an alien race comes and decides that humanity can't be trusted with nuclear weapons.
I am leaving soon, and you will forgive me if I speak bluntly. The universe grows smaller every day, and the threat of aggression by any group, anywhere, can no longer be tolerated.
In science fiction and in adult drama, these themes were explored. You got to experience it. We really don't have many movies like that or any cultural experience that allows us to process this threat.
So I think you're right. It's cultural, it's political, it's a function of our priorities and what the media is covering. On the Beach, 1959. I had not heard of that movie. Gregory Peck and Ava Gardner were in it.
A great movie, by the way. I mean, it's just really wonderful performances.
Fred Astaire as well.
The war started when people accepted the idiotic principle that peace could be maintained by arranging to defend themselves with weapons they couldn't possibly use.
And Anthony Perkins.
Anthony
I'm looking
Perkins.
at him right now.
That's right.
So what I think made Dr. Strangelove so convincing and so timeless was the fact it was a satire.
Yeah.
And having read about how Stanley Kubrick approached that film, I believe the idea at first was to make it a serious movie. But it would not have been believable. They thought movie audiences would sit there and say, well, of course an American general can't seriously be contemplating killing 10 to 20 million casualties, tops, depending on the breaks. That was George C. Scott.
But it is necessary now to make a choice, to choose between two admittedly regrettable, but nevertheless distinguishable post-war environments. One where you got 20 million people killed, and the other where you got 150 million people killed.
You're talking about mass murder, General, not war.
Mr. President, I'm not saying we wouldn't get our hair mussed, but I do say no more than 10 to 20 million killed, tops, depending on the breaks.
That's exactly right.
So they made it a satire with Dr. Strangelove character, loosely based on Werner von Braun, the Nazi who wound up working for Disney, right? Not to digress about Werner von Braun and the V2 rocket factories in Nazi-occupied Europe. But Dr. Strangelove is timeless because it reflects the absurdity of nuclear war. But I'm finally going to get to my point here, Joe. At the time, there was a popular book. The title was On Thermonuclear War.
Herman Kahn.
Yes, that's right. The author writes that nuclear war is winnable.
Yeah. Well, you know, these themes are still with us. They're still reflected today, although on a somewhat reduced scale. And the view of thinkers at that time was summed up in the slogan, better dead than red, you know. And the idea was it was better to resist what was seen as a worldwide communist effort to dominate the world, to take away American freedoms, to occupy America itself, that it would be better to die in resisting that than to live that way. And so we shouldn't be afraid of nuclear war. We shouldn't be afraid of going up and confronting the Soviets or the Chinese, even if it led to nuclear war, because that was preferable than living under that rule. And you see that again now, where you see this debate about whether we should be deterred by Putin's threats of using nuclear weapons. And people are saying, somewhat like George C. Scott, saying, look, what's the worst that could happen? Say we do use nuclear weapons. I'm not saying we won't get our hair mussed, but casualties will be limited. You know, as he said, 10 to 20 million tops.
Depending on the breaks.
You know, and so you see the same kind of attitude, like we can't be afraid of nuclear war. Wrong. You should definitely be afraid of nuclear war. It will be unlike anything else humanity has ever experienced. Even one nuclear weapon used on a populated city would be a level of destruction we haven't seen since World War II. 10 nuclear weapons used on 10 cities would be destruction beyond historical experience. Yeah. And 100 nuclear weapons could mean the end of human civilization. And just to remind you, there are 13,000 nuclear weapons in the world, over 90% held by the United States and Russia. And keep that in mind as you develop your policies, for example, on how to deal with Putin's invasion of Ukraine.
I want to get back to Eastern Europe in a bit, but one more point about Dr. Strangelove, although I could talk about it all day. When General Turgidson is talking about 10 to 20 million casualties tops, President Merkin Muffley, played brilliantly by one of my favorites, Peter Sellers.
I will not go down in history as the greatest mass murderer since Adolf Hitler.
Perhaps it might be better, Mr. President, if you were more concerned with the American people than with your image in the history books.
General Turgidson, I think I've heard quite sufficient from you. Thank you very much.
So he had enough of General Turgidson, but you wrote something for the Quincy Institute in which you cite former Defense Department official Frank Miller, who casually suggested responding to Russian nuclear use if Russia were to use a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine by firing a low-yield, quote-unquote, low-yield nuclear warhead from a submarine somewhere into the wilds of Siberia just to send a message. And this is madness. These aren't fictional characters. These are real people. What's going on here? What is a low-yield nuclear warhead?
Well, there is a real debate going on now, and I was just corresponding with a former military officer who's now doing military analysis on the risks of the Ukraine war. And we were arguing over the effects of using low-yield nuclear weapons. And the whole point of developing low-yield nuclear weapons is to blur the fire break between conventional and nuclear. It's to make the explosive yield of a nuclear weapon small enough that policymakers and military commanders would feel safe using them on a battlefield, for example. Modern day nuclear weapons are enormously destructive. So if you take as your benchmark the Hiroshima blast, roughly 15,000 tons of explosive force, 15,000 tons, a very large explosion, but that is that's small by contemporary standards. Most of our weapons, most of Russia's weapons start around the 100 kiloton threshold, 150. So 10 times larger, 20, 30, 50 times larger.
It's impossible to get your mind wrapped around the power of these weapons. Go ahead.
Right. So one modern nuclear weapon, you drop it, it would be like dropping 10 or 30 Hiroshimas. And it would completely devastate an average city, both with the blast and then the fireball that's set off by that, setting off mega fires, and then the radiation, of course. So these are horrible weapons. So the idea is, well, we are self-deterred, some people say, because they're too destructive. So let's shrink them down. Let's get something that's half Hiroshima, a tenth of a Hiroshima. So we have weapons. We just deployed them under the Trump administration. One weapon is called the W76/2 Warhead, and we now have that on some of our strategic submarines. So these long-range missiles that can go thousands of miles and carry thermonuclear bombs, now a couple of them carry these very small 5-kiloton weapons, so 1/3 Hiroshima. And the idea is that we could use that in a crisis, and we wouldn't be afraid of using it because it was too destructive, too horrific.
I was going to ask, what is the logic here?
Well, it goes back to this idea, and it's been discussed for years, that you could have a limited nuclear war, that you can control the escalation. You shouldn't be worried about breaking the nuclear taboo. We haven't fired a nuclear weapon in combat in 77 years. We don't even test nuclear weapons above ground anymore. The last above ground nuclear test was in the early 1990s. And so we don't see nuclear explosions anymore, right? And they're saying, well, don't worry about crossing this nuclear taboo because it's controllable. We can do it at a small scale and it will be comparable to conventional weapons. That's not true. The smallest nuclear weapon we have in our arsenal is called the B-61. It's an airdropped bomb. We have about 100 of them pre-positioned in Europe. And it's what they call a dial-a-yield, meaning you can decide how big you want it to go. 110 kilotons, so that's, roughly 8-9 times Hiroshima, but you can go down to 0.3 kilotons. That is 300 tons of explosive force. That's about the size of the blast, the ammonium nitrate blast that blew up the port in Beirut. Okay, we don't have a conventional weapon that big, but if you want to understand what that explosive yield would be like, think of the destruction of Beirut. That is 0.3 kilotons. And they say, look, that's a terrible weapon, but it's not a world-ending weapon, right? We could drop that on for example, a Russian tank formation, and we could wipe it out, and it would be relatively contained. And some people then believe, and that would send a message to Russia that they should back off, that they've gone too far and they would sue for peace. The problem is not in the initial blast, but of what happens next. And you always have to be afraid of making the fallacy of the last move, thinking that your move will win the game. Your move is the last one. No, the other side gets a move too. Yeah. And the fear is that they respond in kind. And this is the debate that we have here in the country right now. And I'm debating with people about that. Yeah. On the flip side, if Putin should use a nuclear weapon because he's losing the war, and this is the real risk, then what do? NATO, United States have enough conventional firepower that we wouldn't need to answer a small nuclear weapon. The smallest yield of those warheads is about 10 kilotons, so 2/3 Hiroshima size. And if they do that, what do? what does the West do exactly? And if we decided to have a military response to that, which I think is likely, we could send in enough conventional firepower to decimate the Russian invasion force in a matter of days or possibly weeks. We wouldn't need nuclear weapons, but the argument goes from people like Frank Miller, no, we have to respond in kind. You have to send a nuclear message back that he's gone too far, and we're willing to go that far too. And then what happens? And that is the nuclear escalation that nobody knows. When you play this thing out in war games, I got to tell you, most of the war games that start with this kind of scenario quickly escalate into global thermonuclear war.
I wonder if you would feel that way if you were living in Ukraine, because that's where these bombs would be dropping, at least at first, before they start dropping in other places. Wow.
Yeah, and then you, of course, one of the things about nuclear weapons is it's not a conventional weapon. It leaves behind radiation that would contaminate the area for years and at low levels for tens of years. With the cesium-137, strontium-90 byproducts of fission, that would stay in the soil for decades.
My gosh. Or cobalt thorium-G. No, I can't help myself.
Cobalt thorium-G? Radioactive half-life of, I would think that possibly 100 years.
There's no time for levity.
When's the last time you saw Dr. Strangelove?
I want to watch it again.
It really is a great movie. It helps you laugh about these things and don't get too paralyzed by fear as you're discussing these truly horrible and terrifying possibilities.
I shouldn't be laughing about it because people are actually talking about this in real life. It's not General Turgidson. And about the last move fallacy, I am familiar with that as a bad chess player, right? You always feel like you've got your opponent and
I got him cornered now. There's no way out
on you. So what happened to the anti-nuclear movement? It's quiet. I mean, you don't see it. You mentioned the 1982 Central Park protest, the demonstration with 1 million people. When was the last time you saw something like that in the United States?
Well, that was the largest demonstration ever held in the United States until the day after the inauguration of Donald Trump, when you had 1.5 million people come out in demonstrations in January 2017. And I have worked in the anti-nuclear movement now for many years. I'm a little bit of a chameleon. Wherever I go, I think that's the most important place to be. So when I was on congressional staff, I thought Congress was the most important, body to be deciding these issues. When I was an expert at think tanks in Washington, I thought expert analysis was the most important thing, writing a report, writing a book on this, that would convince people, that would affect policy. And then when I became the president of Plowshares Fund and was raising and giving away millions of dollars to advocates, I thought advocates were the most important. We had to stir the pot. We had to bring some political pressure on people to change policies. And I would say the advocacy part of that has really faded over the last 10 years. It wasn't too long ago that Barack Obama was making his first foreign policy speech in Prague in April of 2009, where he laid out a vision of the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons. And we had op-eds from people like George Shultz, Henry Kissinger, Bill Perry, Sam Nunn saying the time has come to eliminate nuclear weapons. And we really thought, well, here we go. Here we're going to finish the job. Well, that was all beaten back. None of that happened. None of that. The last treaty, the last negotiated treaty we've had on nuclear was done in December 2010 when the Senate approved the New START Treaty. That's it. That's 12 years ago. Nothing else has happened since then. And the part of the reason is that the anti-nuclear movement has faded. It is a shadow of not just of what it was in the 80s and 90s, and people still sort of use that as their touchstone, but even what it was 10 or 12 years ago. And I think a reckoning is coming. These groups have to recognize that they failed. And I was part of that we failed. The strategies we pursued over the last 12, 10 years did not move public policy, did not result in greater awareness, in the reduction of nuclear weapons budgets. Quite the opposite. Nuclear weapons budgets are ramping up. We're in the middle or the beginning stages of a $2 trillion spending spree on U.S. nuclear weapons that will carry us through the next 25 years, building a whole new generation of weapons. What's the answer to that? There isn't even an attempt to come to reckoning with that. Part of what happens when organizations fail on an issue is they deny the failure. And they just keep thinking if they do the same thing they've been doing, but maybe a little harder, that will fix the picture. But I'm afraid it won't. We need a complete rethink of how to change U.S. nuclear policy.
It's depressing, the amount of money that the United States and others are spending on this, and the fact that unstable countries like Pakistan and India have nuclear weapons. The last time there was you mentioned the early 1980s and that NATO exercise. I was going to start asking you about the last time there was a real possibility of nuclear war and the awareness around it, right?
Yeah.
Probably the Cuban Missile Crisis, that whole era, Korean War to the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was very front of mind.
Right. Well, that's the last time, you saw it played out on public stages. And the reason was you had U.S. Russian forces heading towards combat, right? That's what was going on. Kennedy had declared a blockade of Cuba. Khrushchev had sent ships carrying nuclear missiles into Cuba. They were going to come to a confrontation. They were going to hit the naval picket line, and that could result in fact, we started dropping depth charges on Soviet submarines that were accompanying those ships. So we did come really close. What we learned, by the way, decades later, was that those submarines that we were dropping depth charges on to force them to surface were carrying nuclear-tipped torpedoes.
Oh, my.
Right. And they were under order to fire if they were challenged. And one of the captains testified 30 years later in a conference in Moscow that he was the captain of that ship, and they had to take a vote. They needed all three leaders to decide to use the nuclear torpedoes, and he was the only one who voted against it. His second in command and the political commissar voted to use them. So we escaped nuclear war in the 1960s by the vote of one Soviet officer. So that's how close we came, right?
That's right. That's how close it can be.
There's also been a history of nuclear war being started by accident, by miscalculation. And the last one we know of was in 1995, when the Russians thought that the launch of a Norwegian weather rocket was actually a U.S. submarine-launched ballistic missile heading towards Moscow to set off a giant nuclear explosion that would blind Russian radars, which is one scenario for how a U.S. first strike would begin. And for the first time in history, the Russian military brought the nuclear football, the command and control codes, to Boris Yeltsin, opened them up in his office and said, we're being under attack. You have to launch our missiles. Man. Fortunately for us, Yeltsin wasn't drunk.
No, he was, and that was a big problem for him.
He didn't believe his friend Bill Clinton would do that to him.
Great point, because I was going to say, and that was during a time when U.S.-Russian relations were pretty good. Clinton and Yeltsin got along.
There was no nuclear explosion. They closed the nuclear football. We dodged a bullet. But what would happen if that scenario happened today, happened now? We just had an experience in India and Pakistan where India was testing a cruise missile that went off course and went into Pakistan last month and struck down in Pakistan. Now, how are the Pakistanis supposed to know that that's not a nuclear-armed cruise missile? So you can see these kinds of mistakes happen. They're rare, but they're not zero. And these risks of an accidental war are as great or maybe even greater than an intentional war. And you now have the added problem of cybersecurity. We just had an instance this week where hackers went into and penetrated into Moscow and falsely claimed that a nuclear attack was imminent and people should go to their basements. This were hackers, third party, like non-state. No government did this. You see the threats are compounding, raising the risk that something truly terrible could happen, even when no one wants it to.
We know that President Biden and President Putin do not talk. President Biden continues to call Vladimir Putin in public a war criminal, a killer committing genocide. All those things may be true, but it's the role of the president to ratchet things down, is it not?
You know, they say in Washington that a gaffe is when a politician accidentally tells the truth. And Biden has committed a number of gaffes like that during the Ukraine war, most famously his comment at the end of his Warsaw speech that, for God's sakes, this man cannot remain in power. And that's something that many of us think, but it's not the best thing for a politician to say, especially when you're trying to negotiate with that person, because the only way you're going to end the war in Ukraine is a negotiated settlement. Neither side is likely to prevail militarily. So you've got to have a negotiated settlement for that. But I have to say, I give President Biden high points for how he's managed this crisis and hasn't taken the nuclear bait. Remember, this war began with massive exercises on Ukraine's border, including during those military exercises, the testing of 6 different nuclear-capable systems. And this is something Putin has done for 20 years. He incorporates the testing, exercising of nuclear-capable forces in his conventional forces. Russian doctrine sees an integration of nuclear weapons with conventional war. And Putin himself started making threats. Don't oppose me, or there will be consequences unlike anything you've experienced in history. And Biden has not responded in kind. No nuclear threats back. He even canceled the test of an ICBM that he thought could be misconstrued as nuclear saber rattling, in stark contrast to the ICBM that Russia just tested as a direct intended nuclear signal to the West to back off. Biden has been fairly contained about this, fairly restrained, hesitant to, in his military aid packages, to give Ukraine weapons that could escalate the crisis beyond what he thought Putin could bear. Only now are we seeing the shipment of heavy equipment going into Ukraine. So I think we've been fairly restrained, but you can see what Biden really thinks, and it's what most of us think, that Putin is a monster, that Putin is engaged in a level of destruction that we haven't seen in Europe since the end of World War II, and that the only way he's going to be stopped is if he's militarily stopped.
Well, it raises a couple issues. My last 2 questions for you. First, about Russian military doctrine. Correct me if I'm wrong. Russia, according to its doctrine, will use a nuclear weapon first if there is a grave threat to its national security or its existence by a conventional attack by its enemy. It can use a tactical nuclear weapon in response to a severe conventional attack. Since Putin sees Ukraine as part of Russia, that tells me that he might be willing to, and of course he would have to get people to go along with this unless he can just unilaterally do it. I don't know if that's how it works. But that tells me that he sees Ukraine as a potential target.
Yeah.
Am I wrong about that? What are the circumstances?
No, you're right. You know, I was on the International Security Advisory Board for the Secretary of State back in 2014 during the Crimean invasion. And we were doing a study for the Secretary on U.S.-Russian strategic dialogue. And suddenly Ukraine happens. And it throws everything up in the air. We have to readjust all our assumptions. And we start exploring this issue of nuclear use. And it was then that we became aware, and most of us hadn't realized this, that there is this doctrine called escalate to de-escalate. It's not clear whether this is an official doctrine or not, but enough high-ranking Russian military leaders have talked about this, that it's certainly part of the options. And escalate to de-escalate is sort of the reverse of the NATO strategy that we had during the Cold War, where NATO forces feared that the Soviets had such a conventional military superiority that the only way for us to stop a determined Warsaw Pact tank thrust through the Fulda Gap into Eastern Europe would be to use nuclear weapons to stop it. And so we had a policy of using nuclear weapons first. Well, that Cold War ended, Warsaw Pact dissolved, Soviet Union dissolves, we don't have that anymore. Well, now Russia's on the other side of that. They believe that they could face a conventional battle with Western forces or Western-backed forces where they would be at the disadvantage, and the only way to stop that would be to escalate to the nuclear level. And the doctrine says that they would use a nuclear weapon first as a signal to the West of the seriousness of this crisis, and the use of that, whether by a demonstration shot or a target on the battlefield, or, and this is included in the doctrine, using one of their strategic weapons to hit a target in the West or possibly the United States, that this would send a shock that would cause the West to back off, right? So that's the strategy. So they say that they would do this if there was an existential threat to the state. Okay, now we get to your point. What's the state? Is it Vladimir Putin? If he feels that if he loses this war, he's going to lose power and possibly his life, will he then use a nuclear weapon first? Does he have the authority to use a nuclear weapon first? You know, in the United States, the president and the president alone has the unfettered ability to launch a nuclear weapon. And once he decides, nobody can stop him, right? In Russia, there's a 3-party system. Okay. 3 officials carry the nuclear football: the president, the minister of defense, currently Shoigu, and Gerasimov, the head of the general staff. And the idea is that all three of them have to agree. It's not clear whether that's under Putin's rise and consolidation of power, whether that system is still operative, but it's also unlikely that either one of those two would refuse an order from Putin. So in effect, Putin's got the ability to do it. Is he crazy enough to do it? That's the unknown.
Well, thank you for answering my question. So in the United States, if the president wants to do it, that's it. I mean, people can try to talk him out of it, but...
Well, they might not even know what's happening. This is why the terrors of the Cold War are still with us today.
Yes.
The mechanisms we set up back then, when you were worried, when what I was doing, a duck and cover drills, and you were worried about a surprise first strike, something coming out of nowhere that was intended to knock out all our nuclear weapons and prevent us from retaliating, you had to be able to respond real quick to launch our missiles before the other side could destroy them. And that's why the president was given the authority to do it on his own. No consultations required, and given the ability to make that decision within 15 minutes. And so it's rapid, it's decisive, and that ability is still with us today, even though the strategic situation is vastly different from what we feared in the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
And your point reminded me of something from Dr. Strangelove again. Kubrick was criticized for making it look like a nuclear war could be started so easily. Right?
Oh.
His movie, although fictitious, wasn't that far from the truth. I mean, in the movie, the president actually doesn't order a nuclear strike, but there was this loophole that allowed military commanders to launch the missiles if the president had been taken out by a Soviet first strike.
Yes.
So General Turgidson creates this scenario, Plan R, provisions of Plan R provide.
Plan R is an emergency war plan in which a lower echelon commander may order nuclear retaliation after a sneak attack if the normal chain of command has been disrupted. You approved it, sir, you must remember. Surely you must recall, sir, when Senator Buford made that big hassle about our deterrent lacking credibility. The idea was for Plan R to be a sort of retaliatory safeguard.
A safeguard?
I admit the human element seems to have failed us here.
So my last question to you, now that I've done one last Dr. Strangelove digression.
I'll see if you stick to that.
Are you concerned that Congress is engaging in no serious debate about open-ended military support for Ukraine?
Well, this is where I was going to go. And this is, I'll give you my personal view on this, and it's a little blunt. Congress has completely failed to seriously discuss the nuclear threats we face, what our response should be to that, to exercise any reasonable oversight over nuclear weapons. And I say this as somebody who spent 10 years in Congress. I was on the professional staff of the House Armed Services Committee and then the Government Operations Committee. I investigated weapons programs. I had oversight over NATO conventional and nuclear strategy. I mean, I explored this thing from top to bottom. And we used to have serious hearings on this. On my bookcase at home, I have briefings, books on the hearings that we had on the Strategic Defense Initiative, on the nuclear modernization, over and over again. There are no hearings in Congress at this point on U.S. nuclear forces or policy that have any level of seriousness. What you have is sort of show hearings where a group of generals and a couple of senior officials show up before a subcommittee. They present testimony. They're asked a few questions, usually about parochial interests. Are you going to build this in my state or my district? And then it's over. And there was no serious discussion of how many weapons we need, of what would happen if we were to use any of these weapons, and what the plan is for reducing these weapons. And by the way, how much is this all going to cost? None of that happens. They've abdicated responsibility.
Well, there's no debate over even sending conventional weapons to Ukraine, which is, you can say, prolonging the war. I know that sounds cold-hearted. I mean, I don't want Ukraine to be dominated by Russia. But at some point, we have to reevaluate this. Because the longer the war goes on, the more Ukrainians die, the more of their cities are reduced to rubble. I guess what I'm trying to say is, where the hell are the diplomats?
Well, you raise a very good point, Martin. And look, you and I may disagree on this, but this is a legitimate debate. And it's true. If we continue to arm the Ukrainian forces, we give them the ability to continue to resist the invasion. And that means the war is going to go on. But what's the alternative? Don't give them the weapons and they're forced to surrender. There's two sides here, and Russia could stop the war tomorrow.
That's right.
If it just stopped fighting.
That's
If
right.
they just agreed to the ceasefire the Ukrainians have offered. But this debate is not happening. It's not even happening in my own think tank, the Quincy Institute. Most of my colleagues at Quincy are on this side, that we shouldn't be arming the Ukrainians, or that the U.S. has the ability to stop the war and we're not doing enough of it. I disagree with that. That debate isn't even happening in Quincy. It certainly isn't happening in Congress.
And I'm not sure that's my position either. I'm just saying there needs to be a debate, as you
Exactly.
just said.
And that's, when I was on staff, that's what we would do. Our idea of a good hearing was to present the best arguments from both sides and have them duel it out on the table in front of the members and have them have some serious thought. You don't see many hearings like that anymore. They're more staged by one side or the other, whoever controls the gavel, to sort of validate their point of view rather than think out the problem.
This is ultimately Russia's responsibility for starting the war, and they could, of course, end the war tomorrow, right? I don't think it's fair to say the Ukrainians should just surrender. What are Russia's war aims? I mean, that's really what I'm getting at. We don't know what Russia's war aims are. If it's just the Donbass again, then okay, let's reach a settlement about the Donbass and end this thing. If it's to dominate all of Ukraine and topple the government in Kyiv, although their first attempt at that failed, well, that's a different story.
We don't know what their war aims are now. We know pretty clear from the rhetoric and the military operations what they were, as you say. They thought this was going to be a 2 or 3 day war, a larger scale version of the successful war Putin waged in Georgia, right, in 2014, where it was over. They were in and out in 5 days. That's what they thought was going to happen. It didn't happen. They're now regrouping. Putin has lost the battle for Kyiv, and now he's trying to win the battle for Donbass. If he wins that, and his chances of doing that are stronger, they've regrouped, they have a new strategy. This is going to be armored conflict on the Great Plains of Central Europe. This is not city fighting that decimated the Russian troops. This is armored formations advancing under sustained artillery cover across the wheat fields. And that's why you see all the urge to get more heavy weaponry in to try to defeat those armored assaults. But if he succeeds in that, and I believe the aim is to basically consolidate control over all of the Donbass region, make a land bridge that links that up with Crimea, and then basically you'd control all of southeastern Ukraine. Does he stop there? I would say that would be smart to stop there, that you could declare victory and go home. But once you've got that, and if you win, and if you've decimated the Ukraine forces, there's going to be a great temptation to keep pushing west, for example, to Moldova. Again, these strange little countries that you never even think about, they could become critical global pivot points.
I know some of our listeners are probably scolding me. How dare I suggest that Ukraine should just let the Donbass go? However, everyone who has an internet connection can go find this article in Foreign Policy magazine, written in 2019 by an expert on Russia, a political scientist at Rutgers University, Newark, Alexander Motil. The headline of the article, "It's time for Ukraine to let the Donbass go." He argues that reintegration would be too costly. Beyond an expensive reconstruction, it would entail reintegrating a deeply pro-Russian region at a time when Ukraine is finally moving to the West. And again, this was written in 2019, so several years into the separatist war, not now when a major war is underway. So,
yeah, I don't know what the answer is, but it's really not up to us. I mean, this is something Ukrainians and the Russians have to settle. And if I were to predict, I would think that Ukraine's going to have to make some territorial concessions to end this war. It's going to be very hard to take the Russian forces out of the land they already occupy. I don't think Ukrainian can militarily achieve that. So that may be part of the settlement. But you realize as soon as you say that, you realize what Ukraine's going to need in exchange for that: really solid security guarantees. Not assurances like they have now, guarantees that if they stop fighting and they cede that territory, that they're not going to be attacked in the future, or if they are, that no kidding around, the West is going to come to their aid. Very tricky stuff, but that's the shape of a negotiated settlement that you might envision.
I mean, that's how wars end, through settlements. We have it in our heads: World War II, unconditional surrender, and the complete conquest of the enemy power. Maybe that's what Putin is thinking about Ukraine. But Vietnam ended after years of negotiations, while both sides were hammering each other.
You're absolutely right, Martin. Total victory in war is rare in history. Most wars end in negotiations.
I will leave you with one final... I lied. This will be my final Dr. Strangelove.
I knew it.
Yes, you knew it. We must not allow a mine shaft gap.
Sir, I have a plan. Monsieur, I can walk!
Joe Cirincione, we thank you for your expertise and for tolerating my Dr. Strangelove obsession. On the next episode of History as It Happens, we'll be joined by Anna Reid, who just returned to the United Kingdom after spending the first weeks of the war in Ukraine. And we'll discuss the uses and abuses of history by one Vladimir Putin. History as the foundation of nationalism. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.